Hello, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to ODI Global. My name is Emily Wilkinson. I'm Director of RESI, the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative, and Principal Research Fellow at ODI Global. I just wanted to say a few words about RESI, for those of you who are not familiar with the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative. We set RESI up 5 years ago as a global advisory network to support small island developing states around the world. We have about 100 affiliates now, and we have just produced the first State of SIDS report. So if you haven't grabbed one already and you would like to, please do on your way out. It's a flagship report that we will be producing every 2 years, which reviews all of the literature and research about different issues faced by small island developing states and progress that's being made towards the objectives of the Antigua and Barbuda agenda for SIDS. So RESI's mission is to ensure that SIDS are not only represented in global decision making, but are actively shaping it. And we do that through research and evidence and convenings like this, as well as a SIDS leadership training program and a number of different events and activities to support policymakers. Before I hand over and we kick off, just a couple of housekeeping points. If you need the toilets out of this door, out the door you came in and round to the left. There's no fire alarm planned for this afternoon. We had one already this morning. So if it does go off, you need to go back to the entrance the way that you came in. And we have a colleague who's severely allergic to oranges. So please, if you have any in your bag, don't get it out and peel it. Okay, so this session, Financing and Governing the Food Systems Climate Health Nexus in SIDS, we want to really explore what it would look like to take a systems approach to these issues in small island developing states. How can we really shift the paradigm, stop working in silos and really make some progress across these three critical and interconnected issues? How do we need to be thinking about this differently in SIDS than we do in other parts of the world? To explain that to you and to sort of set up the conversation, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Mariam Rezai, who's the Food Systems Lead and Research Fellow at ODI Global. Over to you, Mariam.
Hello, everyone. I hope you got your copy of. I was telling Emily that I don't know when was the last time I was holding my publication and it wasn't online, so it feels good. It's only my publication. Myself and Matt Bishop, who we'll see before or after my presentation. So it is great to see many of you. I can't say that I have had a lot of experience with SIDS, but this past 2 years with ODI and also working with Emily and colleagues has been an amazing kind of learning journey, but also, reflection. So let me just, before starting my presentation, reiterate one point, that as a global community, we are not really short of solutions to address climate change, health, and food system issues. We know that, we all agree on that. But what is really challenging is how to effectively deliver on all of these three development issues at the same time, especially when the resources and capacities are limited. There are trade-offs that we all know. And also we have various agendas that are governed in silos. And there are a few places where these constraints are more consequential than small island developing state. And we'll get to that why this is very, very important. So what I want to talk about over the next 10 minutes is really covering that where are the current finance and governance mechanism are falling short, and why this is happening, and what's a different approach might look like. Oh, I do have that, yeah. Great. So there are two things here that we all agree on. The first is that states face a daunting set of climate challenges and a disproportionate vulnerability to external shocks. And the second thing that, again, we all know and agree on is that the food system in states are shaped by deep structural factors, including, but not limited to, colonial legacies, exposure to volatile global markets, limited land, dependence on tourism, and of course, fragile ecosystems. What is less understood, though, is how a changing climate is affecting what people can eat, their quality of their diet, also ultimately their health. And because this connection is not always made explicit, food and nutrition are treated as second-order concerns within the climate policy. And also climate is it's not yet consistently built and mainstream into how we as food system people think about nutrition and health. So what does this disconnect look like in practice? What we see is a triple burden of malnutrition. That means undernutrition, macronutrient deficiency, and obesity. And in many states, 2 or even all 3 of these burdens are present at the same time. And I've included here a few figures to give a sense of the scale. In 2022, 31% of people that were surveyed across states, they said they're not able to eat healthy and nutritious food for different reasons. And a further 2.6 million people experienced moderate or severe food insecurity. That was linked to rise in heat waves and drought above the long-term average. But of course, that's a part of the picture. And we know that cyclones, floods, they are destroying crops, infrastructure, and also slower changes to fisheries, all feed into the same chain. And we also have the burden of the non-communicable diseases. In 2021, of the 13 countries in the world with more than 30% risk of premature death from a major NCD, 7, more than half, were small oil and developing states. And 3 of those were above 40% death rate. And within the states, of course, it's a heterogeneous regions. So this burden is uneven. Pacific states, for example, experience more severe macronutrient deficiency and obesity than those in Caribbean and other regions. And there are many reasons, of course, these nutrition indicators in many states are deteriorating, but one of the main ones is how food security and nutrition is financed. So what we see is a kind of double deficit. What does it mean? It means that too little funding overall goes to SIT relative to the scale of the need. And of that, too little reach the parts of food system that would make the most difference. By that, I mean local food production, fisheries, nutrition-sensitive agriculture. And these numbers here, they set out clearly this imbalance, that between 2016 and 2020, states paid out 18 times more in debt service than they received in climate finance. Per capita, they received 7 times less climate and resilience finance than the LDCs, and 11 times less than lower middle income countries. And that is despite comparable or even greater vulnerability. And their share of global climate finance for adaptation is just 0.2%. But one thing that I want you to pay attention is that food emergency assistance now makes up more than half of the total official development assistance for food security, while support to agriculture development and food system development has fallen back to where it was a decade ago. And what does it mean for SIDS? It means that external financing is increasingly treating chronic structural nutrition crisis as an acute emergency rather than something to invest in, something structural. And I also want to particularly draw out for this audience, like the figure on ocean, that ocean-related funding accounts for just 6% of the total ODA in SIDS, which is really little, which is nothing, like small share, given that ocean is the economic and nutritional foundations of these countries. So before I turn to solutions, it's probably worth having a quick look on how this misalignment affects food security and nutrition. One thing, of course, is the policies that are export-led development, and meaning a lot of focus on cash crops instead of indigenous crops, for example. We have also promoting plantation systems. You know, it's a colonial way of investing. Trade liberalization and also other structural adjustment that each have left a legacy that constrain the development of local food systems in SIDS. So the result is a food environment now, which is full of imported, unhealthy, ultra-processed food that dominate the market and the table, the consumer's table. And the evidence also challenges the assumption that is always made. And what is that assumption? Assumption is that we always think that rising incomes automatically improve nutrition. It doesn't. Because the cheapest, the most accessible, and the most heavily marketed food are ultra-processed food. And logical household response to this is, you know, they go for cheaper, more convenient, and better, longer shelf life. And we are talking also about the context where nutrition education is very little. And these all are particularly acute in SIDS because they are very import dependent. And in some cases, they import 80–90% of the food. And also trade commitments that the countries, the governments have made, kind of have narrowed down the policy tools that government can use to regulate what enters the market, because you depend on that supply chain. You don't have much influence on it. And also domestic production rarely reaches the scale or price competitiveness that are needed to compete without sustained support. And the last point from the context that I wanted to mention is how underappreciated aquatic food systems are. And the fact that our discussion at food system communities still default to agriculture and livestock. And that's the conversation that we have been having just now with some colleagues. So for many SIDS, the ocean is central to food and nutrition. In coastal communities, seafood provides 50–90% of the animal protein people eat. And 3/4 of Pacific communities who are reliant on coastal fisheries are projected to unable to meet their food security needs by 2030. And 2030 is just 4 years away. And yet, globally, we have only half of the national fishery policies treating nutrition as a key objective. And in most SIDS, fisheries and agriculture sit under separate authorities with separate mandates, data system with separate partners and separate funding, and financing also mirrors this divide, treating the ocean as an environmental priority rather than food security infrastructure. So that brings me towards the end of my presentation that is also going to be that open to discussion through our panels and also expert interventions. Where does this all leave us? It starts with reframing. SIDS are often described in development terms by what they lack. They lack land, they lack scale, fiscal space, administrative capacity, but there is another description that is equally accurate and applied far less often, that SIDS collectively govern nearly 30% of world ocean. And they steward some of the most biodiverse coastal and marine ecosystem on the planet. SIDS indigenous food practices have been refined over centuries to exactly function within the ecological constraints. that they face. So the core challenge here, let's be honest, it's not the shortage of assets. It's a failure of development frameworks that determine which assets are visible in financing and policy, which ones are attracting investment, and which are excluded by the categories that we are using to define them. And from that reframing, in the policy paper that we developed, we set out 4 interconnected shifts that I want to be very clear that they, if taken together, holistically and systematically, could deliver co-benefit across health, resilience, and livelihood. So the first is about delivery. We have all heard a lot of case made for system thinking. Over and over again, in COP28, throughout UN Food Systems Summit, all the follow-up processes, we've been talking about what does it look like, what is it to have the system thinking. But what has not changed is the delivery structure. Programs are still designed and financed through sectoral ministries, thematic funding windows, project-based modality, each with separate reporting lines. So the shift that we are advocating for is really to equip governments and partners to actually deliver on integration, deliver on systemic thinking and systemic approaches through coordination that is anchored close to the center of the government, financing that works across sectors, and shared systems for monitoring and accountability. And the last one is really key. The second shift responds to the tendency to treat SIDS as a single category and apply off-the-shelf packages across different contexts. We were just talking about the development models of some of the African countries coming in, like by development partners, but brought to SIDS, and they're wondering why they're not working, why it's not working in delivering impact. So because SIDS is such a heterogeneous, region, Barbados, Kiribati, Singapore, Solomon Islands. So defining a region-specific food system typologies offer a way to group countries by characteristics that actually shape how their food system functions, including extent of export agriculture, the role of subsistence fisheries, degree of urbanization, influence of tourism. These are the criteria that we should consider for investment on food systems. And we have to tailor the investment to the context. The third is what I was mentioning, a marine governance gap. So treating fisheries, reefs, lagoons, mangroves as core food security infrastructure, not simply environmental assets in a separate policy lane, and really placing them clearly within national development and adaptation plan. And the last one, but certainly not the least, is about recognizing indigenous and community food system as investable assets. Because across many states, these are functioning production and governance systems that deliver measurable outcomes. Yet they are rarely treated as investable components of national strategies or program or funding and programming and policies. So in practice, what does it mean? It means that we need to support communities' land right, like tenure right over land and marine governance, and also locally led institutions to manage them, and evidence base that would allow them to be integrated into the national adaptation strategies and climate finance. So let me close by drawing this together into a few key messages. First, that in SIDS, climate change, food insecurity, and malnutrition are interconnected challenges. But policies on climate, food security, and nutrition remain fragmented and siloed. And that fragmentation comes at the expense of population health. The second is that these island nations face a distinctive set of food security and nutrition challenges, and that is why one-size-fits-all responses don't work. And the last message that we would like you to take away from this presentation is a need for a paradigm shift, one that connects land, ocean, nutrition, health, and climate, and treats indigenous knowledge and marine food systems as a strategic resilience asset. And that a new kind of dialogue, partnership, and ways of thinking. And the dialogue like this afternoon is really the first step, or one of the first steps towards that. So thank you so much. Don't forget to read the brief if you need more information on any of the aspects I touched on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Mariam. Definitely food for thought. We will move on in a moment to hear from our SIDS representatives online, and I will ask Matt to introduce them. But first, I think we would like to hear a few sort of welcoming introductory remarks from Kieran Atwell from FCDO. Kieran is the head of the SIDS Hub at FCDO, and the SIDS Hub has been supporting Resi really from the start, so we're very grateful to your support and welcome you up to give some reflections. Thank you.
Hi, afternoon, everybody. Just say it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and what a great presentation that was just given. I joined the SIDS Hub about 2.5 years ago, and I've got really obsessed with kind of the oceans and how important they are to SIDS, and everything that came out from that report I think was just really on point. So thank you for that. So I mean, the presentation points out to this conversation is really timely and it's important. Food security, it's no longer a narrow development issue, but it's at the heart of resilience, prosperity and stability for small island developing states. And from the UK's perspective, SIDS are vital partners for climate, nature and sustainable development. We know that they're at the face of the acute challenges, but they're also showing great leadership and showing the world how to respond to some of these urgent challenges. So food security in SIDS, as has just been pointed out, it's fundamentally a structural challenge. SIDS rely on imports. That leaves them exposed to price shocks, supply chains, and global volatility. I mean, just the events globally over the start of this year are just proof to that. And at the same time, domestic production is constrained by limited land, water stress, and scale. So the task isn't simply to ensure food supply, it's to build resilient food systems and to support better nutrition, stronger livelihoods, and longer-term stability. That also means recognizing links, just as has been said, between food security, nutrition, and health outcomes. And it's really important to value locally led and indigenous food systems as part of the solution. The climate crisis is making this much harder. Extreme weather, sea level rise, ocean changes is affecting agriculture, fisheries, and supply chains. And too often, these shocks make reliance on imports even greater. And so the cycle of vulnerability just keeps continuing. And the UK SIDS strategy, which was launched earlier this year, has a big focus on this and the fact that there's disproportionate climate risks that land on SIDS. So, I mean, food systems and SIDS, they're inseparable to nature and especially from the ocean. It says SIDS steward about 30% of the world's oceans, and fisheries and coastal ecosystems are essential and also part of the cultural identity for SIDS. And so protecting ecosystems is not a separate environmental agenda, it's fundamental to food security itself. I feel I have to pause and say it's just reassuring that what I'm saying aligns with what was said. I feel like I'm repeating a lot of it, but it's reassuring if not anything. And so in the UK SIDS strategy, we focus around partnerships, improving access to finance and supporting growth, including through blue economies. And in practical terms, this means supporting climate resilient agriculture and fisheries. It means supporting and strengthening supply chains, infrastructure, and local markets. It means scaling nature-based solutions that deliver the best for the environment and food security and economic gains. And a major part of that is sustainable blue economies. So I can talk a little bit about where the UK is working with SIDS. So we, in the SIDS Hub, have a sustainable blue economies program. And part of that, we've got There's in the room, which works on supporting SIDS on plastic strategies and implementation. We work with CFAS, an arm's length body that's looking at how to strengthen capacity in ocean science, data and planning. We also have a program called Climate Action for Resilience Asia, and that's about working with SIDS and accessing adaptation finance. Also a wiser program, which is about supporting SIDS to think about early warning systems and actual practical tools that can help protect their food production and supply chains. And then finally, there's various different initiatives, but there's also a climate finance network, which is about helping SIDS governments integrate climate risk into planning to unlock finance for resilience and including in food systems. Access to finance, it remains one of the biggest challenges to SIDS, and it's one of the greatest focus of the SIDS strategy. And it's where I personally spend a lot of my time from the SIDS Hub. And it's important that we try and crack this, because if we want to move from short-term crisis response to long-term resilient systems, this has to be addressed. So ultimately, food systems are a strategic cross-cutting issue. Progress here delivers on climate resilience, nature protection, economic stability and public health. And it's important that we think about the right partnerships and investments to get behind this and give SIDS the best opportunity. So my final point, resilient food systems are central to resilient islands. If we get this right, we deliver not only better food systems, but stronger economies, healthier communities, and more sustainable oceans. The opportunity is now to move faster. We can align finance, partnerships, local leaderships behind the solution, and I hope the next COP gives us some results. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. So it falls to me to moderate this first part of the conversation now, where we're going to have three interventions from contributors on the screen from outside. They've all been asked a very simple, straightforward question, which is to think about examples of challenges relating to food security and examples of new or old approaches that are linking food systems, health and adaptation and how they're working, which is kind of the focus of the policy brief. We're going to begin with Ambassador Tanya Romaldo, who's the permanent representative of Cabo Verde to the United Nations. Is the ambassador on the screen?
Yes, good morning all. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. I tried to put on the video, but apparently I cannot do that on my end. Anyway, I'm glad to join by voice. Okay, it seems okay.
We can see you.
Good morning, all.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Good morning, all. As I said already, I'm very sorry I cannot stay to be here for the whole meeting, but other urgent engagements in New York do not allow me to. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here this morning on our side. For you, it's afternoon, I know. I would like to start by thanking OD Global, RESI, and of course all the partners for convening a SIDS Day during London Climate Action Week, and also for the timely discussion that we are starting right now. For Cabo Verde, a SIDS located in the Sahelian region of the Atlantic, the links between food security, climate resilience, and public health are not theoretical. They are part of our daily reality and growing challenges. Food systems, climate, and health are usually discussed as separate sectors, financed through separate instruments, managed by separate institutions, and measured through separate indicators. Yet, on the ground, they are inseparable. When severe drought reduces the agricultural production, food imports increase. And when the imported food becomes the cheapest and most accessible option, the population's diet deteriorates and public health cost rises. On top of that, SIDS also face more frequent and intense climate shocks. and governments are forced to divert the already scarce resources from long-term development purposes to emergency responses. This is a cycle that we as CITES are trying to break. In Cabo Verde, we import the majority of our food. We are highly exposed to cyclical droughts, water scarcity, and changing ocean conditions. At the same time, like most island states, we also face a growing burden of non-communicable diseases linked to nutrition issues and changing consumption patterns. A climate-resilient food system is therefore not only an agricultural objective, but a health objective, an economic objective, and also a need for adaptation. This is why Cabo Verde has increasingly adopted integrated approaches that seek to connect the food production to water management, to renewable energy, nutrition, and community resilience. We are investing in climate-smart agriculture, including drip irrigation, water harvesting, and the use of renewable energy in food production systems. We are promoting sustainable fisheries and economy initiatives that strengthen our food security while also protecting our maritime ecosystems. Don't forget that Cabo Verde is ocean. 99.4% of us is ocean. We are also integrating nutrition considerations into a broader development and social protection policies. Our experiences are producing some positive effects, but they are also unveiling that our biggest challenge is not the absence of solutions, but the lack of adequate financing to implement them. International financing remains organized in silos. A project that improves nutrition may not qualify for climate finance. Another project that strengthens the climate resilience will probably not fit into the health funding criteria. And the project that supports sustainable food systems may struggle to demonstrate returns that attract private investment. Governments end up spending considerable time navigating the fragmented funding streams instead of implementing the integrated solutions. Our administrative capacity is already very stretched, and this fragmentation creates significant transaction costs. We need to shift from sector-based financing towards system-based financing. We need financing instruments that recognize the interconnected nature of food security, climate adaptation, and health outcomes. We also need greater flexibility from our development partners and international financial institutions to support nationally led priorities rather than narrowly defined sectorial projects. The Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for CITES, the ABAS, provides an important framework in this regard. It recognizes the need for integrated approaches to resilience, food security, health, and sustainable development. However, to implement it, there are three priorities. One, we need to strengthen the national governance mechanisms. Integrated outcomes require integrated decision-making. The ministries responsible for agriculture, fisheries, environment, health, finance, and planning must work in an integrated way and plan together around shared objectives and shared indicators. Two, we need to invest in national capacity. CITES do not need more short-term consultants. What we need is long-term investment in institutions, in technical expertise, in data systems, and project preparation capabilities. Sustainable transformation for SITs, and not only, requires local knowledge, national ownership, and enduring capacity. And finally, we need to improve the access to finance. Despite contributing least to the climate change, SITs continue to face disproportionate barriers in accessing climate and development finance. Application procedures remain too complex. Transaction cost remains too high, and eligibility criteria often fail to capture the unique vulnerability of small island developing states. The international community must operationalize vulnerability-based approaches, such as the MVI, the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, so that access to finance reflects reality rather than income levels alone. Colleagues, looking ahead to the upcoming COPs on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification, all happening later this year, there is an opportunity to elevate food systems as a central pillar of climate resilience in SIDS. Food security should not be treated only as humanitarian, but as an issue of investment, resilience, and increasingly also as an issue of public health. To conclude, allow me to underline that the challenges facing SIDS are all interconnected. Our responses must be that way too. We need to align financing, reduce fragmentation, strengthen national pipelines, and accelerate the implementation of country-led initiatives. If we succeed in financing and governing the food system climate health nexus effectively, we will build a more resilient food systems, healthier populations, stronger economies, and more sustainable island futures, where no person, no community, and no island is left behind. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks hugely. Thanks hugely for that first intervention, Ambassador Romualdo, which I think echoes a lot of what we said in the policy brief in the presentation that Mariam gave, the importance of integrating all of these seemingly disparate issues that connect to each other, integrating systems, levels of governance, and thinking quite seriously about institutional investments and national ownership and capacity building. So thanks hugely for that. And I think on behalf of all football fans, we really, really hope that you do well on Saturday. And certainly everybody in the Resi team is rooting for Cabo Verde, for sure. Okay, so we move on now, again, for the second time today. We're taking up a lot of his time. Ambassador-at-Large Dean Jones from Antigua and Barbuda, who's going to give us our next intervention from the screen. Hello again, Ambassador.
I'm just turning on my mic. Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm actually currently in China. I am attending some meetings here, actually related to blue economy related issues. As I said earlier, I served as Minister of Agriculture and Minister of Blue Economy, so I'm intimately aware of the issues that affect Antigua and Barbuda. And I was very surprised to hear my previous colleague talk about Antigua and Barbuda problems and issues, which I know are quite deep and probably the same across the region. We face in the islands, you know, we do have potable water supply issues. And we generate a lot of our water from diesel engines. We have reverse osmosis plants where we take water from the ocean and convert it into potable water using energy from diesel engines. And that is a real problem. And so this is why farming in Antigua, Barbados, and many islands is a huge problem because you spend a lot of money producing this water, and then you have to throw it in the ground to water crops. It's really a big waste and costly waste of resources. And one of the things that I noted with the previous speaker, and she's absolutely correct in that, well, the previous two speakers, we need to transition the islands away from land-based agriculture, which is very uneconomical. Maybe in Jamaica, Trinidad, in some of the large islands, Guyana and so on, where they have high rainfall, it is okay. But in those islands that are currently suffering from drought conditions, farming on land really, it makes no economic sense, quite frankly. I know that there's some technologies available to use less water with certain specific crop types, and we need to explore some of that. But the main issue for the islands really is to do more ocean farming, because the inputs to do ocean farming, you really need no water. The water is there, and it doesn't require a lot of energy. But in the islands, we have no history of farming in the ocean. The ocean in the Caribbean is mainly used for tourism, for leisure, and that sort of thing. We have no history of farming, ocean farming. And some islands have begun, looking at it, where they do some aquaponics, where they use, fish and plants like lettuce and that sort of thing. But in terms of actual ocean farming, it's really very, very underdeveloped. I know that in Asia, in Vietnam, China is one big example. I'm here now in China. We have learned that 70% of the seafood I should say the seafood they consume in China, 70% is farmed, whether it's plant or animals. In a country with 1.5 billion people, 70% is farmed, So it shows the potential of ocean farming. And so there's certain species that are recommended, because I know sometimes in some countries they do farming, but they tend to farm the carnivorous fish rather than the plant-eating fish. Farming carnivorous fish simply means that you're going to be catching other fish to feed this fish, which really also makes no economic sense. But farming specific species, and the species that you get that can give you the nutrition you need to reduce obesity and malnutrition in the region are there. They're present and all around us. The bottom feeding fish or the bottom feeding seafood like the lobster, the conchs, they're in abundance. The fin fish that feed on plants, they're in abundance. But one of the things we do is that the fisheries division in Antigua, for example, they limit the catch of certain species because overfishing will create a problem. I know as former Minister of Agriculture that there are certain species of animals that are completely extinct in the wild, but they're very abundant on farm. And take the beef, the cow, for example. Those animals don't exist in the wild anymore because they've been hunted into extinction, but they are very abundant on farms. We get milk from them and beef and other products like that. And we have to stop the catching of fish, and particularly the valuable species, and do more farming of these valuable species, which is very possible with the right technology and the right investment. And that is clearly where the problem is. As I said, we have no history of doing that in the Caribbean. Our waters are shark infested. And so the expertise we need to farm certain specific species. In Antigua, for example, where they have the Stingray City, that is a tourist attraction, where they feed the stingrays. These are wild stingrays. They come ashore, and the tourists are allowed to swim with the stingrays because they feed them. They catch the shrimp to feed them, and that sort of calms them down. They're not aggressive. And so you can swim with them. And when they initially started that program, they ran into a lot of problems because we have an abundance of hammerhead sharks, tiger sharks. And so they had to fence the area off to prevent the sharks from coming close to the shoreline because there were so many shark attacks. Now they have sort of learned how to deal with that and mitigate that. But I know that farming in the ocean in the Caribbean does present some problems. It's not easy to do. And one of the things I learned in China when I asked about that, they said that, there are no sharks in China. They've already exterminated all the sharks. They've eaten them, really. But in the Caribbean, eating sharks is not part of our food source. We don't, you might find occasionally where people do eat them, but it's not a normal part of our diet to eat sharks. So, the sharks basically prey on people rather than the other way around. So, so we do need the expertise to transition to ocean farming. And, I think that would help us a lot in acquiring these expertise, technical training, and maybe it should begin at the university level, at the school level, where we begin training young people on how to do these things and to develop the right techniques for ocean farming. There are a lot of plants that also can be farmed in the ocean. We have an abundance of plants, the sea lettuce and the sea moss and quite a few other plants that can be farmed, not only for human consumption, but to also as animal feed and also to feed the plant-eating fish. So I have looked at that, and we are currently looking at that. We the University of West Indies has started the COBE, the Center of Excellence for Oceanography, and we also have a lot of other. One of the things that we are working closely with China on is to develop the China Caribbean Marine Center, Marine Cooperation Center, and we also are working with the British government on certain specific projects as well to help us to develop the capacity to do more ocean farming and setting aside using marine spatial planning to set aside certain areas for certain specific activities in the ocean. So an area of the ocean can be designated as tourist, for tourism. Another part can be designated for growing plants and animals in the ocean using marine spatial planning. So these are some of the things that we are looking to bring aboard and involving a lot of the communities that, the coastal communities, and get them involved in some of these activities. But, we're still a long way off. And as I said, what we need is investment. The markets for some of our Caribbean species of lobsters, parrotfish, and so on is very huge. If we learn to farm these creatures, I think that it can be transitional for us in terms of our economies, because we're still very reliant on tourism. Most of the islands are like upwards of 60–70% GDP tourism. But ocean farming, mariculture or aquaculture, whatever you call it, is a great way to transition our economies from just tourism to more of an agriculture, food-based export type business. So I will end my comments there. And if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. That was a really, really fascinating intervention. I think, so the analysis in the policy brief focuses on the interconnections between nutrition and health and climate. There's an entirely different story that I think could be told that's very similar about the connections or lack of connection between agriculture, environment, and energy, which is clearly a significant challenge in many Caribbean countries, especially for exactly the reasons mentioned: the cost of energy, the difficulty of accessing sufficient water in many places. And then there's this really interesting question about ocean farming, mariculture, the extent to which this provides an alternative way of generating resources for consumption, and the kind of planning that would be required in order to generate that and determine what the different uses of different parts of the enormous sea spaces that many SIDS have could be. So we move on to our third expert intervention. This is Dr. Charisse Adinsall, who's the strategic mentor with the NGO Regenerative Vanuatu. So she's calling in from Vanuatu in a very different time zone to where all of us are based right now. Are you there, Charisse?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you, maybe slightly muffled.
Okay, hang on. Is that better?
Yes. Yeah, I think maybe a bit closer to the mic.
Yeah, okay. Right here. I'll just share screen if that's okay, and hopefully it works. Are we all seeing that?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. Hi, my name's Sherry Suddens, the Senior Research Fellow at the University of Sunshine Coast and Research Project Lead for the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research and Managing Director for the Regenerative Verification Program under Regenerative Vanua. Regenerative Vanua is a not-for-profit registered in Vanuatu, however supporting Vanuas throughout the Pacific in their regenerative pathways. I'd like to thank the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative and ODI Global for inviting me to present today, and also acknowledge the previous presenters that provided fantastic insights. So I'm really happy to follow on from them. I'm sorry if I'm a bit incoherent. It is actually 1 a.m. for me, but I'll do my best to stay alert. I'd just like to begin my presentation on food systems transformation in the Pacific, highlighting the power of language in supporting transitions. Language really matters in how we understand food systems, and it can either limit or uplift how we see ourselves and solutions. While the term SIDS is widely used and important in global discussions in the Pacific, there is a growing shift in framing. Through the blue Pacific continent, countries are positioning themselves as large ocean states, connected through vast ocean territories. Vanuatu has shown this reframing by executing arguably the most successful David versus Goliath diplomatic feat in modern international law through the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion on Climate Change. This reflects a region with growing confidence, coordination and influence, moving from being seen as vulnerable to being recognised as leaders, shaping global agendas. There's a beautiful quote from Apele. He describes the Pacific region as our sea of islands, an interconnected system, not isolated places. And I think this framing helps shift how we think about food systems, not as fragmented sectors, but as living connected systems across land, ocean, culture and community. So all my previous presenters have really set the scene for this. I'm just repeating really. But Pacific food systems, they're facing mounting pressures, impacting not only on food security, but also culture and well-being. Climate impacts are affecting both agriculture and fisheries, and it's creating increasing instability. There's also a very high dependence on imported foods, often less nutritious and highly processed, but this dependence is not necessarily rational, and I'll go into that later. This has driven some of the highest rates of non-communicable diseases globally. At the same time, there are growing challenges around food and land sovereignty. These challenges are interconnected and they require more than incremental change. They require a fundamental shift in how food systems are understood and supported. And I'm glad we mentioned paradigm shifts earlier, so I'll touch on that. Much of the global response is focused on sustainability, with an emphasis on reducing harm and maintaining systems. In many Pacific contexts, this is not enough because systems have already been disrupted or disconnected from culture and ecology. What is emerging is a shift towards regeneration, restoring and renewing systems and transforming relationships between land, food, people and health. This shift, this paradigm shift, also reflects a return to Vanua, where land, people, ancestors, spirit, culture, and ecosystems are inseparable, where care is based on responsibility, not ownership. It is something you belong to, not something to exploit. To care for Vanua is enacting the responsibility as custodians for future generations. And we're finding in our programs that Vanua is a powerful term for reframing land from a resource to a responsibility, and it's uniting Indigenous people to remember what really matters and enact stewardship as custodians. And it has various terms throughout the Pacific, as you can see. So It has been said, we cannot regenerate systems using the same frameworks that created the challenges in the first place. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We don't need more frameworks and compliance and certification processes in food systems that are entrenched in current systems thinking. We need a complete paradigm shift from sector-based approaches to whole systems thinking, from compliance and certification to learning, relationships, and accountability over time. And this paradigm shift is already being implemented across the Pacific. The Regenerative Verification Program is a rigorous, transparent, outcomes-focused alternative to certification. It supports continuous improvement and place-based action rather than check-based compliance. And it works at the scale of whole systems, vanuas, not just individual farms or businesses. The transition has not been without challenges. One of the most significant has been shifting mindsets to this new paradigm and financing regeneration. Shifting mindsets takes considerable time, consistency, and commitment. It requires unlearning, relearning, healing, connecting, and repairing connections broken and knowledge lost. We also have a data problem in the Pacific, which limits donor and investor confidence in funding regeneration and climate resilience. The Regenerative Verification Program provides donor and investor confidence through high-quality data that's outcomes-focused and understands the complexity of living systems in the Pacific. The Regenerative Verification Program is revaluing subsistence and customary economies, strengthening diversified systems and diversifying livelihoods, reconnecting soil health to food health and nutrition, supporting learning-based outcomes-focused approaches. And these transformational changes are being supported through regenerative learning exchanges and journeys that are growing motivation, knowledge, and capacity through connection, healing, and practice. Through these regenerative learning exchanges and journeys, communities are now supporting knowledge exchange in rebuilding soil health, restoring biodiversity, strengthening local diets and knowledge systems, and reconnecting to Vanua and enacting stewardship. And Vanuatu is now providing strong leadership in this space. They're advancing regenerative agritourism and gastronomy pathways through the launching of their policy. They've been nominated for the IGAT World Region of Gastronomy Awards in 2027 for their work in decolonising the food systems and addressing the shaming of local food. They're now hosting the 2027 Third World Gastronomy and Agritourism Summit with the theme Regenerative, Climate Resilient and Nature Positive Food Systems. So I hope everyone in the audience would like to come to that and join us in Vanuatu. And Vanuatu is also housing the regional office for the Regional Pacific Regenerative Verification Initiative and Regenerative Verification Program. And this sits under the Blue Pacific Strategy. Importantly, these are not projects, they're pathways for systems transformation. If you'd like to connect or learn more about our programs, we're big believers in collaboration, not competition. This is not about turf wars. We don't have time. We need to collaborate, and together we can get more finance to these regions that desperately need it. And you can reach out and contact our team at the Regenerative Vanua website or come and visit us at our headquarters in Vanuatu. I hope you all were able to hear me. My connection was strong, and I thank you so much for having me today. And I'll be around for questions. I'll try and stay up till 2 a.m.
Thanks, Cherise. I think you've got a lot of takers for the summit, quite a few in the room. I mean, yeah, that was just fantastic. So much to take from what you had to say that we can get out on the table for conversations. I mean, I was struck by the power of language. I mean, this idea of regeneration, not just sustainability, rebuilding. I think in the Caribbean, people would talk about repair in much the same way. Policies that are not extractive, that are about rebuilding and adding value to what is already there in a kind of holistic, whole systems thinking kind of way. So that was really, really compelling. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand over now to Marianne, who is going to come up and moderate the next part of the conversation with all of the other panelists. Thank you.
All right. I'm just so energized by these presentations, and I'm sure everyone is. Also, I think when you listen to the grassroots experiences and their journey and the challenges and the achievement and impact, it kind of show us that it can be done. It's possible with partnership, with thinking out of the box, and looking at the system. So yeah, it's my pleasure to moderate this panel. We are slightly over time, but I'm sure we can make up for that. So it's my pleasure to invite Marie-Ange Sarakayao, Director of External Relationship Global Climate Fund, Green Climate Fund, sorry. Welcome, thank you. And of course, my former colleague, I was working with FAO before, Simon Addison, Senior Economist, FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, is here with us from Rome. And next would be Namita Vikas, Director of Octus ESG. Welcome, Namita. And it's my pleasure to invite Neil Tierney, Director of Global Program, Department of Foreign Affairs, Ireland. What a wonderful panel. So let me start with Marie-Ange. I know that you have to leave. So we heard a lot of different aspects, and finance came up quite strongly. Investment, finance, in various forms. We also heard about moving from sectoral finance to systemic finance. So my question to you is that there are many of the challenges that, as we heard, facing SIDS, which are we sit in the intersection between food system health and climate resilience. But financing, as we have also heard, remain largely sector specific. So how is the GCF supporting more integrated investment? And what do you think are the changes that are still needed to enable these systemic approaches at a scale?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I mean, it was indeed very inspiring. I mean, this whole session and hearing from some of the representatives of these islands, the reality of what it is there, because indeed the challenges are compounded. But I think what I would say, I mean, coming to the Green Climate Fund, the fund doesn't invest in sectors, so we are not at all focusing on sectors. We don't have sector target or anything. On the contrary, the funds is really dedicated in financing the interlinkages between climate, livelihoods, food, health, and that's really what we are trying to do. And in a sense, what this means is indeed they are doing this has there are important barriers. I think probably to your question, what this means is going away from project approach, but really having some kind of system-led approach. And I was glad to hear it, for example, from the last speaker, and really looking at it from this angle to then have this cross-sectorial view. So if I give an example, for example, we have supported the federal state of Micronesia, actually, in a sense, they are quite affected, of course, with rising sea levels, that then bring health issues, unsafe water, and this type of thing. So we have helped them build an early warning system that really provides, instead of waiting for the catastrophe to happen, that helps provide very early on, detect the risk, and provide the right data. So this early warning system really feed into the right data that works for health, for the various sectors, so that then it can provide the alerts and also help them kind of think about systems that are proactive and responsive in a sense, instead of just being, and this has been working very well. And we have seen this also in other islands that we are helping build this type of early warning systems. Now, to your other point, I think what is indeed important, and it was alluded many times by all the speakers at least, is the coordination among the funders. Very, very important, because it's fine to say that we work on interlinkages and so on at the country level, but the coordination among the funders, making sure that we can complement each other. There is this group that has been set up between the Multilateral Development Bank and the Multilateral Climate Funds. And actually this year, GCF has the chair. And so we just had a meeting in Washington during the spring meetings, and there's a deliberate effort indeed to, we have selected a few areas where we really want to be able, in a sense, to have kind of this smooth kind of one entry point, and, you know, avoiding the duplication and this type of thing. So it's work in progress, you know, I mean, we have to be honest, but I think it's also a very important area where we should where we should work. Now, finally, going back to the system-led approach, what we are really investing a lot and accelerating is what we call the country platforms. I think, you know, now we are supporting 20 of them, so it's early on, but we are starting to get good insight and lessons. And the idea, especially when we hear about also the issues of institutional capacity, that is compounded then by all the other challenges that were described, you know, it's really having first this vision, this runway, and not just focusing on one project after the next, but indeed thinking about the system and how they come together. So I think this is really, really inspiring and promising. So.
Thank you so much. And yeah, you touched on country platform, and as ODI, we are quite involved in that. And we are seeing that, in fact, there is there is this coordination mechanism that, you know, like a platform that is housed at the center of the government, and bringing all this like data system and partners together towards more investable projects, more pipeline. Thank you so much. I mean, we have.
And, I should say, of course, that we are also very dedicated, of course, in providing some of these countries more support. That's why our board a couple of months ago decided to open an office in Suva, so for the Pacific. So I think it's part of the dedication in terms of the issues that these islands face, and really looking forward to working with all of you. I really apologize because we have our board meeting in Tajikistan from tomorrow and have to take 3 flights. And of course, when you're in a hurry, you cannot check in the day. So I have to go. Otherwise, I think I'll be in trouble with.
We do appreciate having you here. And thank you so much for your insight.
Yeah, and I look forward to hearing the rest. And
we will definitely continue this discussion. And I also want to, you know, touch on the GCF emphasis on importance of oceans in your financing. And that's something, again, to build on and continue. Thank you so much, Marianne. I mean, if you need to leave now.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. My apologies. Sorry.
Thank you very much. So I'm turning to Simon, and with FAO experience. I know that you have worked, you know, in many other organizations, and of course you have like wealth of knowledge, but just from a multilateral development perspective, a UN perspective, what governance arrangements have been really most effective in helping government coordinate across this nexus of food system, health, and climate priorities? And are there any lessons that you can share from those interaction and programs that are most relevant to SIT?
happily, I think we've already heard of quite a few of the things I'm going to talk about, and they're not rocket science. And I think the challenge is mainly about how to support countries to build the capabilities so that they can apply these approaches that I'm going to describe. But we found that the most effective coordination approaches are really these ones that we've already heard about, which is getting out of a siloed approach to planning and budgeting, and to build structures across the whole of government that can allow for integrated governance and planning and delivery. Now in SIDS, what we've found is that because of lower levels of administrative capacity and resources, and there are limitations to the capabilities of governments. But where integration happens, it serves really as a force multiplier that prevents duplication, as Marie-Ange was warning about, and it helps to align agri-food policies directly with national climate and nutrition strategies more effectively. But where we see these being most effective is where they are lean and they are centrally coordinated and they have clear mandates. So starting from the very beginning to be very clear about what the institutional arrangement is going to be, what its objectives are, what the roles and responsibilities of the different actors are, is really critical. And this can operate through interministerial committees where ministers come together to think collectively about what challenges they face and how to approach them, which is strangely not very common. And also multi-stakeholder platforms where those ministers or civil servants can interact with NGOs, community groups, farmers groups, etc. And that can bring together public, private, and civil society insights and voices so that decision-making can be more collaborative. We also find that this is most effective where it is clearly anchored in targeted data diagnostics. So where we can leverage data and evidence to inform decision-making and use that data to help manage trade-offs, particularly between the different interest groups or different stakeholder groups that are involved in the decision-making processes. But critically, and building on what Marie-Ange was talking about, this has to be linked to climate finance that is appropriate and adequate to actually deliver when decisions are made. And so there are several pieces that need to be brought together. One thing that we've learned, and we've been putting this into practice, is that because of the nature of SIDS, these approaches can often be more effective and deliver more benefit at scale when we support countries to do this regionally in a peer-to-peer collaborative approach. So we developed regional coordination models that can help overcome scale constraints by bringing countries together to do collaborative planning and thinking about what financing they need and how they can work together. And we've been doing this through what is called our hand-in-hand initiative. Now, our hand-in-hand initiative is an approach where we partner with governments to deliver advanced geospatial modeling and analytics with a partnership building and matchmaking approach that drives market-based transformation of agri-food systems by linking data, decision-making, and finance together. And with SIDS, we've been working to develop regional hand-in-hand investment plans and multi-country programming frameworks in the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. So this uses shared diagnostics and coordinated multi-stakeholder consultations with all the players I've spoken about to enable countries to jointly identify priorities, align their policies across sectors, and co-design investment pipelines that can then be linked to climate or development finance. So this builds policy coherence, pools capabilities and expertise, and also facilitates that important access to finance. And I think the country platforms that we've already heard about is another way that I think is emerging that could be brought into this kind of approach. That
exactly, it's different levels, isn't it? It's like the country, more like country-led, nationally owned, like, and link it to more, regional priorities, exchange between countries, having that that kind of space to learn from each other. And because there's so much learning that is happening, even like among different SIDS region, there's so many challenges that are common on climate and health and food system, and countries can really learn from each other. So it's interesting that this aspects of coordination keeps coming up, and what Marie-Ange was talking about and your points really allude to having to place some of these to align with national priorities, to address trade-off, so, like moving away from fragmentations. And then you also mentioned the multi-stakeholder platforms, including private sector, and that leads me to Namita, because in my own work, when I was talking to Pacific stakeholders, one of the main issues that were coming up was private sector, the absence of an effective, powerful private sector that can be engine of growth, domestic private sector. That is. So as we heard, there are many SIDS that have stronger adaptation and food system priorities, but struggle to attract commercial and institutional capital at a scale. So Namita, what are the main barriers to making these investment bankable? And what practical steps can this government and also development partners they can take to build stronger investment pipelines?
Yes. Thanks. Thank you very much for that question. And, as we are hearing everybody, I think one of the first things that came to my mind when I was sitting there, and I have been a commercial banker, that currently there is a big competition between mitigation and adaptation. So that itself splits the capital that is available at the first go. So that's one thing that needs to be looked at. At the same time, I think capital is not absent. It is how it's been deployed, and is it being deployed where it's needed the most. So at one level, say global climate finance is about $2 trillion that have been deployed, but over just under 0.2% has gone to SIDS, for example. So it's not really about the capital shortage in that sense, but it's really about maybe a structural failure to be able to convert the vulnerability into investability in that sense. And therefore the measures to work on that would be very, very important. And we need supply of projects, we need bankable projects to meet the minimum conditions of commercial investors or institutional investors who would bring in the scale that we really require, right? And I think unfortunately the food, climate, health nexus maybe sits at this structural kind of a failure. And I will just talk about a few challenges, barriers, as you said. I think one is there's a kind of a financing paradox that we see. So in SIDS, despite being the most climate exposed, they got 0.2%. I mean, shouldn't they get more capital, right? But that's what, and their requirement is about $11 billion annually. So roughly 6x of what the current flows are going in. That's one. And this is not a large ask in terms of the global scenario that we're looking at, right? But without a financing architecture to channel it, I think that becomes the larger problem. And the gap only widens and it clogs the system between the lenders and the borrowers. And lenders look at risk mitigation, risk transfer, risk acceptance, and no risk avoidance, right? So where do projects sit and where do SIDS sit in this whole scheme of things is very important to understand. So conventional credit frameworks were built for single sector, single country, and we spoke about that, around predictable cash flows. But when we look at the nexus, for example, that I'm talking about here, none of those things are there, right? Commercial lenders need defined repayment sources. So if you look at tourism or health, their unpredictability. A credit accessible borrower is required at the end of the day. A risk premium that it can price. Food systems in the SIDS cannot meet any of these three conditions, and that's because the financial architecture around them needs to be set in. That's not there, right? If you look at the capital markets reality and the borrowing costs, so SIDS have been borrowing $36 billion have been borrowed on international capital markets and bonds, and the pricing, is 7.5% of the coupon, where G7 is borrowing at 3.9%. But these are vulnerable countries; they should get concessionality in that sense, right? But that's not happening, and I think a few things that need to be focused on. One is the fiscal space. So SIDS are also in this indebtedness cycle, right? Because they are borrowing for the vulnerability. So they have limited fiscal headroom to fund long-term resilience investments that sectors like food, so food security or climate adaptation or health outcomes require at one level. At another level, commercial borrowers need sovereign backstop, but because of this indebtedness, either it's all utilized or it's not available. At another level, when you look at risk pricing, there is a kind of a rating methodology trap that I want to refer you to. So climate vulnerability widens the credit spreads. Rating agencies penalize exposures without giving any credit to any kind of resilience activities that have been built in. So just for example, say a SIDS country with a functioning diversified food system is structurally more creditworthy over a 20-year-old horizon in that sense. But credit models have no mechanism to capture prospective resilience benefits. They look at current vulnerability. That's what they price, or that's what they rate without any future adaptation. And then there's a scale mismatch. So, if you look at projects in SIDS, and we worked in Fiji and the Pacific Islands, and there we're seeing the typical, say, food system projects are 5 to 25 billion. Large institutional investors want $500 million projects. Commercial lenders will not want to put in manpower behind assessing small projects. So aggregation is very important, and that's not coming in. And therefore, automatically, because there's also a perception that food, health, these are public spending areas, private capital gets crowded out. It's not their priority sector to come and fund. And there's also another challenge. And, I was looking at some of the ODA numbers that you showed out. But because of the middle income status of many of the SIDS, they also don't get ODA. And their per capita income makes them middle income countries. And therefore, there's loss in access to concessional finance that's out there. Right. So the MVI, the index that is there, that is something that needs to be really working in a SID. And then there's currency mismatch. So, investments are generating revenues in local currency while investments are coming in USD or euros or pounds. And then there's a currency hedging risk that investors are taking into account. Government fragmentation, I think that has been spoken about. I think what are the practical fixes? So I'll come to that, there's a lot of need, and we're seeing this, and we're also working in this area in the SIDS where project preparation requirements are emerging. So there's an urgent need for dedicated facilities to convert policy priorities into investment-ready opportunities, where one can identify clear revenue models, risk allocation, investment grade documentation. So that kind of support is required. And a very good example is the C40 Cities Finance Facility, which embeds technical experts into governments or into project developer teams to create these projects. So I think replicating those kind of models to shift the bankable pipeline materially, I think that would be important at one level. Second, I spoke about aggregation, small ticket sizes. We need to create larger ticket sizes through multi-currency country platforms to create that scale. I think that's important. Then, fiscal tools like debt for nature swaps. I think these are not new, but they're underutilized. And I think those kind of structures would do well, because that really gives the kind of fiscal space that is required for the SIDS. Then monetary policies. I think that is a very important thing. And in Fiji, we worked with the Reserve Bank of Fiji, and they already have a import substitution export finance where they give certain concessionalities to their banks to onward lend. So the banks can then take exposures to certain assets, which can be as prioritized by the island. And in case of Fiji, it's agriculture, renewable energy, and resilient sectors. So I think that's a good model. And I think GTGI also, for that matter, has put up in Papua New Guinea a green finance center where they are looking at channelizing concessional credit to certain sectors where then commercial capital can come in. So I think, in short, what we need to do is we need to treat the food, health, climate nexus as an asset class and not just a developmental objective, because I think it's more perceived as a developmental objective, not my responsibility of the state. And therefore, the commercial capital flows are not there. And then what happens is, once we start treating it as an asset class has pipelines, portfolio structures, credit ratings, investor documentation. All that needs to be brought in. Development objectives will only have budgets and project reports, right? But we need to go beyond that. And I'm really coming from I'm an ex-banker. So I'm coming from that perspective. When I assess projects, that is how one would look at it. And I think these are, some of the aspects that I would talk about from a barriers and what can be done perspective. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, everyone. I think this is just like frantically taking notes, including myself. I loved that you said capital is not absent. It's just such a powerful thing to say, because it really goes against in this context of shrinking or like diminishing ODA. Like finance is not there. It's shifting from one priority to defense, to national security, to whatnot. But so money is there. It's just not where it should be. And what should we do to really direct it to where it delivers impact and benefits for people and for planet? And you had so much to you gave us so much food for thought. And I think one other point that I'm taking away is you echoed what the ambassador from Capo Verde mentioned, is basically that you shouldn't treat these countries based on the income. You should treat these countries based on the level of vulnerability. And this is structural failure that you alluded to like going from vulnerability to investability. And of course, you brought up the aspect of de-risking finance, which us working in agriculture and food system, that is one of the biggest challenge, because it is a risky sector. So thank you so much. We will probably come back to you. So I'm just going to turn to Neil to give us another, perspective from government, from a donor, from Ireland with so much experience on food security and, nationally. And I know that Ireland is also it's very big in transferring that knowledge, transferring that expertise to other countries. So how effective has Irish aid been in supporting the food system, climate, health nexus in small island development state? Tell us a little bit more about that, because we are very familiar with your portfolio in Africa, but personally, I don't know much about your portfolios and your activities in small island developing states.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks, Rezi, for organizing the event, and thanks, Mariam, for the really informative policy paper. I mean, I think just listening to the ambassadors and to the other panelists, it's clear that it's it is forcing sort of a rethink. And I think that it is important as well that whilst there's discussion on paradigm shift, and you just alluded to it, we're already in a paradigm shift. Maybe it's just not the one we want, which is, 23% fall off on ODA. We've got kind of a retreat, a galloping retreat almost, in terms of support to the UN system. We're definitely going to be going through difficult couple of years. So the very institutions that are supposed to be kind of the backstop, the stability that work collaboratively to support small state governance systems such as we find in the SIDS are themselves trying to reconstitute and downscale. So I think we need to really take this into account. But some of the points that Namita was raising there, need to find their way into this discussion too. There's probably opportunities in this forced rethink that's occurring. So definitely glad to join you on this island, having come from one this morning, which is 10%. I discovered of our territorial state, and 18% of our fisheries is farmed. So I was inspired by the Antigua and Barbuda ambassador to inquire a little bit into our own economy as I sat here. But clearly, food, nutrition, hunger, access, equality, these are issues that have underpinned our cooperation program and underpinned our history. So there's a lot that we see in common with SIDS. We've established SID strategies specifically as part of our portfolios to say, yes, we've got a long history, over 50 years of cooperation with Africa, but we're deep in our second SID specific strategy presently. That has a number of aspects, including partnerships. And whilst I've got specific notes about specific projects, I want to react a little bit to some of the discussions, because what we try to do in working with, for example, UNDESA and Data for SIDS is similar to what Simon was describing, what's been described by the ambassadors as well. How can we have systems that are essentially intrastate public goods that overcome local shortcomings in terms of just population size, that dictates small civil services, dictates turnover, dictates people migrating for other opportunities, and perpetuates an instability on the development side, the pipeline side. We also work with GGGI that Namita mentioned. We work with the Asian Development Bank. We have a Pacific and Ireland Pacific fund. It's over 14 million. And the same sort of challenges that are being described, we encounter even with these mechanisms that are built to simplify. So there's almost a sense that there's a proliferation of simplification systems that are then themselves in competition and kind of counterproductive. So I'm just wondering, is there an opportunity in this radical shift in ODA and a rethink on approaches to address climate change and address things as clear as the climate health nexus at the SIDS level, to rethink how we approach that. So we've got a series of projects. We're working with ABBAS that was spoken to by the ambassador. So we supported the development of it. We're engaged around its development and its kind of outreading. So there is the intent for a center of excellence, but within that as well, I think it's like what's already there that's good to good enough, that can bring together the information, to bring together the ministries at the SIDS levels, and then how can we use the regional structures? We, as others, support regional structures in the Caribbean. We're also early investors in the Pacific Resilience Fund. We're engaged with the PIF. But again, how can we bring this together so that we don't, through contributions, create another system that is, that perhaps France is doing something in parallel, or the UK is doing something in parallel? How can we use those emerging systems to bring this sort of synthesis of issues down onto the problems that have been described? So in terms of projects. I mean, we work with the Rome-based institutions, you know, and there's real strength, you know, so we're working with WFP, we're working with IFPAD, we're working with FAO and UN Women on a joint program for rural women's economic empowerment. And in the Pacific, that's working in Tonga, Solomon Islands, Fiji, Kiribati, and it's trying to address climate vulnerability, entrenched gender inequalities, food, nutrition insecurity. But what we want to try and see is you can have proof of concept, you can have a project which has a direct impact, which is built in a resilient manner. But if the fundamentals of the, was it 18 times in debt payments to access to climate finance, yeah, that's not going to be transformative. It's, yes, it's helping a community. Yes, it's technological or information exchange. Yes, our Institute of the Marine can share experiences. We're engaged in the Caribbean on, for example, seafloor monitoring and adding AI to look at coastal erosion, etc. These are all really important technical changes. But at the back of that, in terms of the sovereign state's ability to act and act as collective regions, I mean, your banking narrative of big ticket items, etc. I think the same language with a different tag is there in terms of trying to get the regional bodies to pull together. But as one donor, you know, we can't necessarily do that. And there is somewhat an absence of fora. We support at the UN level with Aurelius. We're very closely engaged with Palau as the chair. We try and support ABBIS deliver, but I think the onus is on us to simplify a little bit our engagement and use the ABBIS pathway as an opportunity for donors, for technical support, for the UN system, and for finance to find a way to contribute to ABBIS in a way in which begins to unpick the complexity, take off some of the layers so that it's simpler for the SIDS states and simpler for those who are contributing. In terms of real results, yes, we've got projects that are having positive benefits on diets. We've got projects that are supporting. It was interesting that both ambassadors spoke to the importance of, the word wasn't celebrating, but to have more relationship with indigenous food products. And, you know, so there are projects engaged with that. Community groups who are supporting. At the macro level, we're also engaged in support, obviously, to the Fisheries Transparency Initiative. That's including with African SIDS. And this is, I suppose, where those massive power imbalances emerge, where the capabilities of SIDS to observe their maritime surface area, the technologies that can now be brought to bear, you know, whether it's through access to better satellite imagery, collective actions in terms of the transaction costs for groups to work in regional areas. So I think that, again, that this moment is presenting opportunities that the next step of kind of that policy research on the ABBIS pathway could be, well, what are the quick wins that technology could provide that the circumstances facilitate for us? So say, I won't go through a shopping list of projects that our entire strategy is based on consultation with SIDS. So I think there's 56 commitments in there. They were all generated by SIDS. So in some respects, it's a scarily transparent policy in that all of the constituent parts can say, is Ireland achieved this or not? You know, so, but it was kind of putting the cards on the table. And that's on an extension through to 2028. But really where we want to be trying to bring our support through to is on ABBIS, is on simplification, and then on our bilateral relationships with Asian Development Bank, with the UN systems, and in coordination with the SIDS at the UN level to try and make life simpler for everyone, so that instead of re-identifying the same problems, we try and find ways to contribute to faster solutions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, this need for aggregation and, you know, bringing pooling assets and pooling partnerships and knowledge together under regional umbrella or under any, kind of collective approach or umbrella that can facilitate assistant capacity building, financing. That is something that I think is really important message we are taking away from this conversation. And I really like your point, like finding opportunities in this new, context that we are facing. It's not going to go away. We have to find ways to navigate the risk and maybe rethink and reform existing systems that is necessary if we want to deliver, or as we hear in many of our conversations with donors, to demonstrate value for money, demonstrate, impact, co-benefits. So thanks so much for all of this. And I also want to, put something to the audience that we are having, let's not forget that one of those forums could be the pre-COP in the Pacific. So maybe collectively we can reflect a little bit that what are the key priorities that we want to bring to Fiji, to Vanuatu, and who are the partners? What are the avenues we can really make the most of that platform? And so I want to also turn to the audience and take any questions or comments and reflection that you have. But I think everyone is interested to hear just one final reflection from you, and maybe starting with Simon, that you would like to see happen over the next 12 months that would improve food system governance in SIDS. What is it that you think, the sky is the limit? Be realistic though.
I'm going to be, for the audience's benefit, because Mariam knows this, I lead the work stream in FAO, trying to understand how to deliver a just transition in and through agri-food systems. And this is, we believe, absolutely central to the interests and concerns of small island developing states, or large ocean states. A just transition for agri-food systems involves transforming agri-food systems, including ocean food systems, to be low impact, low greenhouse gas emissions, but also delivering food security, combating hunger and poverty in ways that are sustainable, just and equitable, particularly for poor and vulnerable groups. So that's central to the concerns of SIDS. And we have a real opportunity at this point in time to bring agriculture and ocean food systems into the heart of the just transition debate. There is an opening that we have from COP30 with the decision on the just transition work program. We are currently, parties are currently negotiating the just transition mechanism and how that will be designed. And this is an opportunity for SIDS to come together and to think collectively and creatively about what a just food systems transition means for them, and to bring their ideas and to make their voice heard in the negotiations between now, the COP31 in Turkey, but most importantly, COP32 in Addis Ababa, where that just transition mechanism will come to fruition. So that's what I would love to see.
That's amazing. And I think I'm going to use this opportunity to also let everyone know that tomorrow morning, we will have a dedicated session on discussing exactly just transition in agri-food systems and what does it mean for communities. And so just transition, Namita.
You said collective, and I just picked on this about the power of the collective. And I was hearing him speak, and I think the opportunity is to create an integrated regional platform that's to mobilize capital, prepare the pipeline. Because see, ultimately, when you're looking at finance, and I'm purely coming from the finance lens, when you're looking at finance, it is not just access to capital, it is the cost of the capital, which is very important. So there could be, so today, as we sit here, SIDS are borrowing from private investors anywhere between 22 to 23%. That's crazy. Where otherwise capital is available for anywhere between, say, 12 to 15%. So how do we bring, that cost of capital down? And if we have that power of the collective as an integrated platform to negotiate those costs and build that aggregated pipeline, I think that would really create that impact at one level. The other point is bringing catalytic capital. How do we bring in blended finance? How do we bring in regional pooling kind of structures? How do we look at supply chains? And then, because in food systems or in health, the supply chain finance that is required. So how do you actually backstop with some guarantees those supply chains who are vulnerable because their cash flows are not, tourism cash flows are very seasonal, right? So they're not predictable. So how do you backstop those? And I think if there is an integrated facility that comes up, which looks at not just capital provision, but looks at also building the capacities of the local financial institutions. Because when we work within, and we're doing work with the Tonga Reserve Bank right now, where we're working on their integrated green finance kind of a roadmap, we're seeing that there's a lot of capacity that needs to be built within the local financial institutions. So it's not about bringing in the DFIs, the larger players like ADB just there to provide the capital, but to also share that experience and build their capacity to be able to then go finance. So I think that kind of an integrated approach would be very, very valuable, where donors like them would play a big role.
Amazing. And yeah, I think that would be a dream if we, and that's something that probably, among other things, Emily is going to speak of, like how Resi as a platform can start like kind of thinking through some of these points that are coming across, from everything that we are hearing, and how we can convene maybe more dialogues, maybe like focusing on one or two quick wins and see how we can simplify approaches. And yeah, looking at integrated regional platform or facilities to bring all this like capital, finance, knowledge, capacity building together. Thanks so much. Let me quickly turn to Neil for your reflection.
Okay. So I think one of the, you said to be realistic, because I was going to say everyone agrees to the MVI and SID's secure concessional financing. But on the middle ground, I think that a kind of a challenge to the data systems that are being built for SIDS to see, are they fit for purpose to serve intersectoral and interim planning? The point made on the near-term observations that credit determines for allocation versus multi-decade resilience investment is the same type of thinking that's needed for diet shift to avoid future NCD costs. So I think, an exam question for the data systems is, are they fit for purpose for that sort of decadal planning that meets the needs for intersectoral planning? And then that relates to whether you're planning the pipeline of infrastructure projects, what you're going to put your public investment in, because we meet with the SIDS representatives several times a year, and they're very open. They say, we're just borrowing to pay back the debt from the last time we took debt from the last natural disaster. It's a vicious cycle. So I think unless there's recognition as to where that's at and where it's going, we can have as many hopes as we wish, but we need to engage with that hard reality, and having the narrative that puts it like that 18-to-1 ratios. Those sorts of realities need to come out of harmonized data systems that serve the regions in a way in which domestic interests can be seen, but not necessarily only be about domestic, but taken regionally. And then that gives you your big ticket questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I could not have wished for a better panel. And I think so, like when we were looking at, what does this event is going to look like? What are we going to get out of it? Yeah, this really exceeded at least our expectation, because we have so much to take with us in our thinking and in our planning for the future of this work that is going to be very much around improving resilience of food systems, food security and nutrition for the island nations. There are challenges that we are aware, but there are also opportunities for rethinking. There is interest, there is willpower. We are not short of capital, we are not short of financing. And so let's take this moment, use the just transition frameworks and work plan, use the COP, pre-COP in Fiji, use the regional strategies and see how we can align with national priority and deliver for island nations. Thank you so much. And I think if you stay with me for a few more minutes, just turning to the audience and see if there are any comments or questions that you would like to, please. And microphone, we can have.
Hello, so my name is Dominique. I'm a recent master's graduate from the University of Southampton. I've graduated with my master's degree in marine biology with oceanography, and I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. So this is a quite topical discussion. And I heard today in this session today that there was a lot of talk about using food from the ocean as infrastructure. And I think this is a very interesting conversation, especially coming from a science background, and how to integrate food security in the age of climate change, especially in the context of mangrove deforestation, which is a huge issue as it's the largest cause, shrimp farming rather is the largest cause of mangrove deforestation. In Antigua and Barbuda, I'm not sure if the ambassador is still online, there are very rich mangrove forests in the region. So I guess it's kind of more of a consideration when we talk about diversifying our ocean as infrastructure for food security, but also balancing in the age of climate change with rising sea levels, as mangroves play an extremely important role. I know Kieran said a lot about her love for the ocean, and I guess that's my question and what the consideration would be. I'm sure the FAO has that as a consideration on their agenda as well.
Thank you very much. So just while I think it's good to, if there are other questions, to take another one. So very, very pertinent point on the trade-offs between food security and nutrition and safeguarding ecosystems and environment. Please.
Hi, yeah, I had a sort of point to raise about the importance of sort of transport and logistics systems in terms, particularly their impact on price, and particularly for archipelago island states, the cost of inter-island transport can be quite challenging when you're moving from maybe more productive islands to less productive islands. So I think looking at those systems and the cold chain and other ways to preserve food are also very important to be considering, and any reflections on that would be helpful.
Thank you very much. Do we have Mary?
Actually, I'd like to pick up the question that the fellow audience member made, because I was thinking something similar. The words that Matt gave earlier today were echoing in my mind about how when we're talking about agricultural systems, climate and health, we should also be looking at the energy nexus, because I'm aware of the research that's been done in the Pacific on how there's been a move towards eating tinned fish, which has lesser diversity of micronutrients. and therefore this implication for people's nutrition because of the convenience factor. And it's exactly what a fellow audience member has said about the importance of cooling, refrigeration, reducing post-harvest losses and so forth. So we know it's an issue, particularly in the Pacific. And I was wondering specifically to come to a question, if any of the panel members had any sort of, lighthouse projects, examples of good practice in that regard from any of the SIDS countries or regions. Thanks.
Fantastic. So we have the trade-offs, we have the logistic cost and transport, and linked to that is the cold chain losses and energy. So I don't know who would like to pick what questions, but please, maybe I start with you, Simon.
Great question, Dominique, and it's a really hard one to answer. But it comes to the heart of kind of what we're trying to think through in terms of a just transition, because at the heart of any just transition process is how to manage these complex trade-offs. The ambassador from Antigua and Barbuda made some really interesting points about how to expand food production in ways that would solve some of the challenges around food availability, access, and quality for the population, that could contribute to economic growth, tackling some of the poverty issues that we know underlie vulnerability to both food insecurity and to climate shocks and climate stress. So, and your points about mangroves and the impacts that fish farming might have is, just throws up another set of challenges. I think from our experience, and I won't go into it in any more detail, from our experience, it's really these intersectoral and multi-stakeholder planning and decision-making processes that are helping governments to tackle these complex, almost wicked problems. There's a tendency when thinking about trade-offs to think in terms of costs and benefits, particularly through the lens of national governments that are really concerned with their fiscal space and their economic growth opportunities. But bringing this just transition framework into view helps to tee up the various different objectives that governments need to think about. And one way that we're thinking about this, you may have heard of Mariana Mazzucato, who's a very eminent professor at UCL, who talks about mission-driven governance to drive decision-making in governments, which starts with what are our objectives, not necessarily what are our solutions. Often governments start with, well, we want to do something like the ambassador said, without thinking more clearly about what are the range of objectives that governments want to achieve across climate, across development, across health, across nutrition. But if we can start with those and come up with our ideas for what our objectives are, governments can make more informed decisions using these data platforms that I was talking about to make decisions that will deliver their objectives through pathways that are not necessarily the first choice, but which can deliver multiple benefits across climate, nature, and development.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
So I want to pick up this question on the transportation and the cold storage that you mentioned about, and I'll just give it a flip, actually. I think it's about the usage of diesel versus solarization. And what we've seen is that as the whole life cycle of how solar industry is evolving, in some geographies, it has evolved to a level where the whole risk matrix is very well understood by financiers. But there are geographies, and especially in the Pacific Islands, some of the work that we have done, where the local banks are still struggling with how do you structure for solar financing. And therefore, you are not just competing with mitigation, adaptation, or the impact need, but you are actually competing then with traditional sectors. So I would rather give credit to a traditional sector than get into understanding the risks, because performance of a solar panel and the nuance around it needs to be understood. And again, financiers always just look at risks and returns. I want predictability and I want the capital to come back, right? So I think there's a lot of investment that is required in terms of the whole learning curve for the local banks. And that was my earlier point in terms of it's not just about providing catalytic capital, but it's also transfer of knowledge. So if there is ADB that has worked in this space, then how do you transfer that knowledge? And I don't have a very good example from the SIDS, but I will give you an example from Africa, which we worked on. This was for Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe wanted to put together a financing facility for decentralized solar. And one of the things that they were keen to look at is women entrepreneurs, which I thought was a brilliant way to go about it. Now, if you look at it and they wanted to get private capital to this, right? So if you look at Zimbabwe as a country from a private lens, the risks are very high in terms of the political risk, the devaluation of currency, depreciation, all of that, right? So we looked at putting together a facility which is the spine would be catalytic capital. And I, as a banker, always say, do not go and set up a separate SPV, special purpose vehicle. Go and put it within an existing financial institution, because you have the infrastructure, you have the underwriters, they know their business, right? In a separate company, you have to then hire everybody to do the job. So we got Old Mutual, which is the largest and the oldest financier in Africa. And they agreed to set up this facility. So we did the structure, and we said that as a commitment, they have to put in $8 million as catalytic capital. Then this facility structure was taken to the UN SDG fund, which gave in $10 million into the facility. So the catalytic facility was to do concessionality, interest subvention for projects. And it was a gender responsive clean energy finance facility that was built. And then came in the private sector, because so there is a 1 to 12%, 1:12 ratio of catalytic capital leverage, right? Then came the likes of Nedbank, and today it's a $45 million facility. By the end of this year, it will be a $50 million facility, and they want to take it to 100 million by 2027. So those are the kind of structures we require in terms of how debt can go. And the facility also has a technical assistance component to work with the local banks to make them understand the challenges that could be there at a smaller DRE level project development. So I think we need to give a cover from all sides. And yes, cold storages are very much important, but they need to solarize. They can't be running on diesel. Thank you.
I think that was very, very comprehensive, and a lot came out of your intervention that I think we can talk about it later. And while you're talking, I'm thinking about a lot of financing discussion that we can have for SID. So over to you, if there is any of the question you would like to.
I'm going to bring it down to the micro, it's kind of related to the food production side. And it was interesting reading your policy paper about the legacy of what is agriculture on SIDS.
Mm-hmm.
That so often it was colonial displacement, it was monoculture for export. And a number of the projects that we're supporting are, with disadvantaged groups, Tonga, Solomon Islands, Fiji, also working with the Joint Programme for Rural Women's Economic Empowerment with FAO and others, is about the amplification of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous food production systems and their role in climate adaptation. So it's kind of the pre-cold storage, the pre-refrigeration part, which is to try and build upon knowledge. There's often a presumption of deep local knowledge, but like so often we've forgotten sometimes as much as we've forgotten our Indigenous food production systems. We've got a number of projects working specifically with women to strengthen their capabilities and domestic production. So that's at the micro, but it has its role provided the macro frameworks are there to facilitate it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
One very short point.
Yes,
I
very short.
I have to say this.
Yes,
But
please.
I think, as a part of this whole work that you've been doing, I think some work on fiscal and monetary policies is very, very important to move the capital. So are we prioritizing these sectors? And are the governments prioritizing these sectors? And therefore, what kind of support they will give from a monetary or a fiscal policy standpoint? Some concessionality by the government in, say, taxation. That will motivate financiers to come to the table.
And with that,
I have to say that. Sorry.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And you left us with a question to think about as we are shaping this area of work. Thank you so much. Very grateful for your time and for your wisdom. And if I can invite you to go back to your seats, and over to you, Emily, for final remarks.
Thanks very much. That was a great panel discussion, great interventions earlier from Sids, from Kieran. Thank you for all of that. I think this is a really robust discussion, a lot for us to go away and think about and work on. Thanks for that, Mariam. we certainly, and there are a number of kind of agendas there that really resonate with the kind of work that Resi does on access to finance, really taking advantage, using the international processes and mechanisms that are on the table to advance this agenda through the COP process and just transitions in particular. We've talked a lot about financing and getting the right kind of vehicles in place to leverage finance at the regional level. These are all things that are really kind of top of our agenda. We talk about a lot, and I think we can start to do more sort of detailed work, and certainly this kind of convening is really helpful to get more voices and more perspectives on these issues into the discussion. So thank you very much. I think we can have a little bit of time for networking afterwards and in the space outside. So do approach panel member speakers that you want to follow up with. This has been a great SIDS day. We have one other event in the evening some of you might be coming back for or staying for. So welcome you to that. We'll have some film screenings. But if you want to keep in touch with Resi, please contact one of us. I think one of our communications team can take your details and put you onto our mailing list so you find out more about these kinds of events and publications. So thank you very much.